You've probably heard of the witch trials of Salem. But what if I told you there was a place in Europe where the flames of fear didn't just consume a handful of lives, but nearly 1,000 women were burned alive? This wasn't some backwoods village with pitchfork mobs. This was a church, a holy institution, and it turned into one of the darkest killing machines in history. This story isn't about witches flying on broomsticks. It's about politics, greed, and fear wrapped up in the language of God. And once you hear it, you'll understand why the idea of witch hunts still haunts us today. So stick with me, because this isn't just another tale of medieval cruelty. This is the true story of how an entire church led thousands of men, women, and children to believe that their neighbors were agents of the devil, and how nearly 1,000 innocent women were swallowed by fire. It started in the late 16th century, in a region of Germany called Würzburg. At the time, Würzburg was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and it wasn't just a town, it was a bishopric, meaning the Catholic Church ruled here with both religious and political power. The bishop wasn't just a churchman, he was a prince, and his word carried the weight of God and king. Now, Germany during this period was a hotbed of paranoia. The Protestant Reformation had ripped Europe apart. Catholics and Protestants weren't just arguing theology. They were killing each other in wars, burning each other's towns, and trying to prove who was the true faith. And when times get unstable, who usually gets blamed? The powerless, the outsiders, the people who can't fight back. In this case, women, poor women, old women, healers, midwives, widows, women who didn't have men to defend them, who maybe knew too much about herbs or were just a little too outspoken. By the 1590s, the Bishop of Würzburg, Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn, had already begun purging his lands of Protestants. But when a harsh winter, crop failures, and plagues swept through the region, he needed someone else to blame. And that's when the whisper of witches started spreading. Here's the thing about witch trials back then. They were less about actual belief in witches and more about control. Sure, people thought magic was real. They thought the devil walked among them. But the trials were also a convenient way to terrify the population, seize land, and silence dissent. The method was simple. Someone, maybe a child, maybe a neighbor, would accuse a woman of witchcraft. That woman would be dragged before a church court, and under torture, she'd be forced to confess. But she couldn't just confess alone. Oh no, she had to name accomplices, friends, neighbors, other women. So the fire spread not just literally but socially. One accusation became 5. 5 became 50. And before long, Würzburg was in full-blown witch-hunting hysteria. We have records of some of the confessions, and they're heartbreaking. Women admitted to flying through the air, dancing with demons, poisoning crops, all because their bodies were broken on the rack, or their thumbs crushed in screws, or they were suspended by ropes until their joints snapped. And the craziest part? Children weren't spared either. There are reports of kids as young as 9 or 10 being accused, tortured, and executed. The logic was, if the devil could tempt women, why not children too? Now here's where it gets even darker. By the year 1626, Würzburg got a new prince-bishop, Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg. And this guy, he took witch hunting to industrial levels. Ehrenberg believed the devil was hiding in every shadow, and he thought it was his holy duty to smoke him out. Under his reign, the persecutions escalated into one of the deadliest witch hunts in history. In just a few short years, more than 900 people, mostly women, were burned at the stake in Würzburg. Think about that number. 900. That's not a trial, that's a slaughter. Imagine an entire town where nearly every family had someone executed. Imagine the smoke rising every week as another group of women was marched to the stake, tied to wooden posts, and set on fire while the townspeople watched. And make no mistake, this wasn't done in secret. These were public spectacles. Executions were meant to terrify the community, to show them that the church was powerful, that the devil was everywhere, and that obedience was the only way to survive. What's chilling is the scale. The records describe mass executions, where dozens of women would be burned together in one go. Imagine the screams. Imagine the fire so hot you could smell it from miles away. Entire families destroyed, neighborhoods wiped out, all under the banner of faith. And it wasn't just Würzburg. Across Germany, hundreds of other witch hunts were happening at the same time. But Würzburg stands out because of its sheer brutality. It was one of the largest single campaigns of witch killings in all of Europe. And here's the kicker. This wasn't happening in the so-called Dark Ages. This was the 17th century. The same century when Galileo was peering through telescopes, when Shakespeare was writing plays, when Europe was supposedly entering modernity. And yet, thousands were still being burned alive because church leaders convinced people that the devil was hiding in their neighbors. So why women? Why always women? Well, the answer is tangled. Part of it comes from old medieval ideas that women were weaker, more emotional, more temptable by the devil. Church writings from the time literally argued that women were more carnal than men, and therefore more likely to be witches. But there was also a practical reason. Many accused women were widows or unmarried, meaning they owned property, land, homes, and once they were executed, the church or local rulers could seize it. So, witch trials weren't just about demons and superstition. They were about power and profit. In other words, follow the money, and you'll find the real devil. But here's where the story takes its cruelest twist. Remember how I said children were accused too? Well, in Würzburg, some of the victims included the bishop's own students. Little boys, from noble families, dragged into court, tortured until they confessed to flying on broomsticks or attending Sabbaths with demons. One 9-year-old child was executed. Can you imagine? And it didn't stop there. Nobles, priests, even respected citizens. Anyone could be accused. Because once the fire got going, no one was safe. The witch hunts became a self-feeding monster. Fear drove accusations. Accusations fueled torture. Torture produced confessions. Confessions created more fear. And round it went, until nearly 1,000 bodies had turned to ash. Let's pause for a second and really picture it. Würzburg in the 1620s wasn't some massive city. It was a town of maybe 5,000 to 6,000 people, meaning almost 1 in every 5 households lost someone to the witch fires. Think of your own neighborhood. Imagine every 5th house suddenly empty, its mother or daughter burned alive, its children orphaned, all because someone pointed a finger and cried, "Witch!" That's the scale of terror we're talking about. The problem with fear is that once it takes hold, it doesn't just stay in one place. It spreads like wildfire. And in Würzburg, that's exactly what happened. At first, it was the women on the margins. Poor widows, midwives, the kind of women who lived on the edge of society and didn't have powerful friends to protect them. But soon, the net widened. Anyone could be a witch. Anyone could be in league with the devil. The bishop's court didn't need real evidence. All it took was a rumor. Maybe you didn't go to church one Sunday. Maybe your crops grew better than your neighbors. Maybe you were seen talking to a stray cat. Boom, suspicion. And suspicion was enough to drag you into a dungeon. Once inside, the outcome was almost guaranteed, because no one could withstand the torture. Let's talk about the methods they used. They weren't subtle. They weren't humane. They were designed to break a person until they would say anything just to make it stop. One popular device was called the strappado. Imagine having your hands tied behind your back, then being hoisted into the air by a rope attached to your wrists. Your left dangling, your arms twisting unnaturally, your shoulders dislocating. Sometimes they'd even add weights to your feet. People fainted from the pain. Many never regained full use of their arms. Another was the thumbscrew. Iron clamps tightened around your fingers or toes, crushing bone and tissue until they splintered. The victim would scream, confess, accuse others, anything to end the agony. And then there was water torture. Prisoners forced to swallow jug after jug of water until their stomachs bloated to bursting. Some suffocated, others choked, but the confessions always came. And once you confessed, there was no going back. Because here's the twisted logic of the trials. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you didn't confess, you were guilty of resisting the truth. The church had built a trap with no escape. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even religion anymore. It was a machine that chewed up human beings and spat out ashes. But there was a deeper problem brewing. The more people they executed, the more the town started to eat itself alive. Accusations weren't just random, they became personal. Think about it. If you had a grudge against your neighbor, or you wanted someone's land, or maybe you just didn't like the way a woman looked at you, what better weapon than to accuse them of witchcraft? It was the perfect crime. The court would take over, do the dirty work for you, and soon your enemy would be gone. This turned Würzburg into a paranoid nightmare. Neighbors didn't trust each other. Families didn't trust each other. Children were taught to watch their parents carefully. Husbands accused wives. Wives accused husbands. It was like living in a world where one wrong word could kill you. One story from the records is especially chilling. A wealthy man's wife was accused of witchcraft. Under torture, she named several others, among them her own daughter. When her daughter was arrested, she too was tortured. She named her mother, and so both were executed. That's what fear does. It twists love, loyalty, even family into weapons. And here's the bigger issue. The bishop and his court didn't want this to stop. Every new trial brought in money. Every new execution gave them more land, more control, more fear-driven obedience from the population. The church claimed to be protecting the people from the devil. But really, they were feeding off the very panic they created. It's the same pattern we've seen again and again in history. Create a problem, present yourself as the savior, and then profit off the chaos. And this chaos wasn't small. At its peak, Würzburg's witch craze was so intense that hundreds of people were executed within just a few years. Remember, this wasn't a massive kingdom. It was a small territory, which means the impact was devastating. Imagine walking through town and realizing that every week more women, sometimes dozens at once, were being burned in the marketplace. Imagine knowing that tomorrow it could be you, that there was no safety, no protection, not even if you were wealthy, respected, or noble. And people did notice. We have letters from diplomats and travelers who passed through Würzburg at the time. They wrote in shock about what they saw. Burning after burning, the whole city gripped in fire and fear. One observer wrote that the bishop seemed determined to wipe out his entire population if that's what it took to root out witches. That's not faith. That's madness. But here's the kicker. While the bishop claimed to be fighting the devil, Europe at large was beginning to move toward reason. The scientific revolution was starting to gain ground. Philosophers were questioning superstition. Some rulers were banning witch trials altogether. And yet Würzburg clung to fire and torture like it was the only thing holding their world together. This created a kind of split reality. On one hand, the rest of the world was moving toward modernity. On the other, Würzburg was dragging itself deeper into medieval terror. That tension between progress and paranoia is one of the key reasons the witch trials eventually collapsed. But not before nearly 1,000 people had been swallowed by the flames. Now let's zoom out for a moment, because Würzburg wasn't the only place this happened. In Bamberg, a neighboring German territory, another massive witch hunt was raging at the exact same time. Hundreds of people were executed there too, and the two territories seemed to fuel each other, like rival towns trying to prove who was more pious by burning more witches. Think about how insane that is. Instead of competing with crops or trade, they competed in body counts. And in Bamberg, the hysteria got so out of hand that even the mayor's wife was accused and executed. That's how you know things had gone completely off the rails. So in Würzburg, when people saw that even nobles and children were being burned, they knew no one was safe. And yet, they still couldn't stop it, because stopping it meant admitting it was wrong. And by then, the blood was too deep. This is the real problem at the heart of the story. Once fear and paranoia become tools of power, there's no easy way out. The leaders don't want to stop because they're gaining from it. The people don't want to stop because they're terrified. And anyone who tries to stop it becomes the next target. That's why the fires in Würzburg kept burning, week after week, year after year, until almost 1,000 women, and men and children were gone. By now, you can see the pattern. What started as whispers of witches had turned into an unstoppable machine of death. And the problem wasn't witches. The problem was people, powerful people, using fear as a weapon. But what happens when that weapon finally turns back on the people who created it? That's the twist in Würzburg's story, because eventually, the same paranoia that killed hundreds of women started threatening the very church leaders who lit the fires in the first place. And when that moment came, it changed everything. The fires in Würzburg kept burning, but something began to shift. At first, the accused were the poor, the powerless, the women who no one would defend. But as the frenzy grew, it reached higher and higher into society. In 1628, a noblewoman named Dorothea Flock was arrested. Her husband, desperate to save her, appealed directly to the emperor in Vienna. He begged for her release, arguing that the trials had become lawless, a machine of torture and greed. The emperor granted her a reprieve, but before it could be delivered, Dorothea was executed, burned alive, even though the highest authority in the empire had ordered otherwise. That was the moment outsiders began to see Würzburg as out of control. But inside the city, the bishop's court pressed on. Torture chambers filled day and night. In one grim year alone, over 150 people were executed. Among them were students from the university, young boys accused of flying on broomsticks or attending Sabbaths. Imagine children, shackled in chains, forced to confess to crimes they couldn't even understand. One record tells of a boy, only 9 years old, who admitted under torture that he had seen the devil in the form of a black dog. For that, he was condemned to the flames. A child, burned alive before the eyes of the town. By now, the city was choking on its own fear. Smoke rose from the execution sites so often that people said the sky above Würzburg was never clear. Families whispered in terror at night, wondering who would be taken next. And still, the accusations spread. The wife of the city councilman, the daughter of a wealthy merchant, even priests. No one could claim safety. In one shocking case, the execution list included 19 children in a single sweep. They were accused of attending a witches' gathering, dancing with demons in the forest. The trial records show their confessions, words squeezed out of them by unbearable pain. One after another, they were marched to the stakes. The madness climbed even higher. One of the bishop's own relatives, a noblewoman of good family, was accused. She too was dragged to trial, tortured, and condemned. Her status couldn't save her. The fire made no exceptions. That's when fear began to eat at the rulers themselves. If noble families and clerics could be accused, what about the bishop's council? What about the judges? What about the bishop himself? Rumors spread that even members of the cathedral chapter, the men who advised the bishop, were suspected. Suddenly, the leaders of the hunt found themselves staring at the same terror they had unleashed on everyone else. But the bishop, Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg, refused to stop. He was convinced he was waging holy war against Satan himself. He tightened his grip, demanded more arrests, more trials, more flames. His obsession blinded him, yet the wider empire was losing patience. Word of Würzburg's slaughter spread across Europe. Diplomats and scholars called it barbaric. Letters described the city as a place drowned in blood and madness. Even neighboring princes began to question how long this could go on. By 1631, fate caught up with the bishop. In the chaos of the 30 Years' War, Swedish Protestant forces swept into Würzburg. Ehrenberg fled, and with his downfall, the witch trials collapsed almost overnight. The killing machine he had built crumbled the moment its master lost power. The prisons emptied, the fires went out, and the city, scarred and broken, was left to count its dead. Nearly 1,000 people had been executed in Würzburg in less than a decade. Most of them women, many of them children, whole families erased, property seized, fear turned into ash. The scale of it is almost impossible to imagine. In a town of a few thousand, every street, every square, every family had felt the touch of fire. Generations wiped away not by disease or war, but by their own leaders, their own church, their own neighbors. And the worst part? None of it was ever about witches. Not really. It was about power, about control, about feeding a machine that demanded blood to keep itself alive. The climax of Würzburg's witch craze shows us the darkest truth of all. Fear, once unleashed, doesn't stop. It grows, it consumes, and eventually it turns on everyone, even the ones who lit the first flame. That's the story of the church that burned 1,000 women alive. A story not just of fire and death, but of how far people can fall when fear is turned into a weapon. When the fires of Würzburg finally died out, they left more than ashes. They left silence. Streets that had been filled with screams were suddenly quiet. Families once torn apart were left empty, broken, with no one to bury or mourn properly. The town itself never truly recovered. People remembered the smoke, the stench, the endless fear. Survivors carried it with them for the rest of their lives. And Europe remembered, too. Scholars, rulers, even church leaders looked back on Würzburg as one of the worst examples of what superstition and unchecked power could do. Over time, witch hunts across Europe faded. Science and reason began to take hold. Laws changed. Trials were banned. And slowly, the age of fire came to an end. But Würzburg's story stayed behind as a warning. What happens when fear is used as a weapon? When power hides behind religion? When truth is silenced by torture? Almost 1,000 lives were burned away. Not because they were witches, but because they were vulnerable. Because they were women. Because they were convenient scapegoats for a world drowning in chaos. The church that burned 1,000 women alive didn't just destroy them. It revealed something terrifying about human nature, that in times of fear, people will believe almost anything, and leaders will use that fear to destroy whoever they choose. And maybe that's why we still use the phrase witch hunt today. It reminds us that once fear takes hold, the fire can come for anyone.